Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me all right? Good. Way in the back? All right. Thank you so much for being here and sharing a beautiful evening that you could be outside enjoying and being here to talk instead about all of these weighty policy issues that Paul talked about, or to talk about probably the most strange and fascinating election season that I, for one, ever remember witnessing. I want to give thanks again to Paul, to everyone who has made my visit here tonight possible. It's really an honor to be with you. And I also want to give credit to my co-author of the book that I will be talking a bit about tonight, Melody Rose, who's the president at Marylhurst University. Melody and I were colleagues at Portland State University together many years ago, and it was from that friendship and that collegial professional relationship that this interest in Hillary Clinton and how the media cover her was born. Yesterday, Melody and I had the pleasure of speaking at the Oregon Historical Society, and on the way over, it occurred to me that we were giving that talk on the 15th anniversary of September 11th. And of course, we've all had that very much on our minds since at least yesterday. And it seemed like a strange choice to me in a way to ask us to talk about Hillary Clinton and the media and gender on the anniversary of September 11th. But there is a way in which it made some sense. And that is because in the shadow of the terrorist attacks of 9/11, there was actually research that indicated that the chances for a female presidential candidacy had been reduced by that attack. Why? Presumably because that attack primed or triggered people's concerns about national security and foreign policy, and because of some of the things that we'll be talking about more tonight, because of the long-held gender associations, the long-held gendered stereotypes around women's ability to handle and be tough enough in the foreign policy realm, that the September 11th attack actually seemed to reduce people's enthusiasm for voting for a woman for president. Now, in 2008, of course, Hillary Clinton ran for president the first time around, and she, as you know, as you might have noticed, was not successful. And one thing that was observed of her campaign afterwards was by Gail Sheehy, a longtime reporter who's covered the Clintons for quite some time and written at least one book about Hillary Clinton. And she observed, as you see, that part of the problem, part of the challenge had been that nobody knew how to run a woman as leader of the free world, particularly in a post-9/11 world. That struck Melody and I as very, very interesting. But one thing I'd like to engage you in conversation about tonight is how the context may have changed since 2008. So what I'll be presenting tonight is a model that we sketched in our book, Hillary Clinton's Race for the White House, a model of 3 interlocking factors that we think shape the chances of any female who seeks the office of the US presidency. And one of those factors is these long-held gender stereotypes. Another is media routines, but a third is the candidate herself and the context that she faces in a particular campaign. And one thing that's so fascinating about this election, among many things, is that we have the same woman seeking the presidency again for a second time, and yet we have a very different context, and we have in some ways maybe even a very different candidate than we had in 2008. So I'd like you to kind of be thinking about that as I walk you through some of the things that we talked about in that book, and I'd like to do that as a way of comparing 2008 with 2016, what is similar and what is different this time around. So let me begin by talking, as I said, about the 3 interlocking factors that shape the female presidential candidacy: gender norms, media routines, and the candidate and her context. And our argument in the book is that it would be easy enough to attribute Hillary Clinton's loss, for example, in 2008, or the challenges of any female presidential candidate. It would be easy to attribute those challenges, those losses, to gender alone, to sexism alone. But we argue in the book that we have to bring other factors into the analysis, that gender alone is not enough to explain whether or not women candidates succeed. And in fact, one of the joys of writing this book with Melody, who is a scholar of women in politics, presidential politics, party politics, is to bring that together with my expertise in political communication and media and politics, and to see what we found by bringing those literatures together that haven't always talked to each other very well. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about gender norms, and obviously one could write many, many books on this topic. Indeed, many books have been written, so forgive me, those of you who are steeped in your women's studies, for example, for a very light brush treatment here. But I want to just touch on a few factors that we talked about in the book in terms of gender norms. Now, what do we mean by gender norms? We really mean the things, the characteristics and the expectations that people may automatically, unconsciously associate with either male or female, masculine or feminine. Those of you who have ever, for example, gone online and taken the so-called implicit bias test are well aware of how this works. The way we can associate, for example, a female first name with certain characteristics very automatically versus a male first name. I invite you to do it. It's really quite illuminating. So when it comes to the presidency, the challenge is that this is a highly masculinized office. But in order to understand how that is such a hurdle for female candidates, we have to understand how far back this history of silencing women goes. And here I really recommend a touchstone book by Kathleen Hall Jamieson called Beyond the Double Bind, which some of you have probably read. Kathleen Hall Jamieson, the former dean of the Annenberg School and a masterful scholar of political communication, wrote the book in part to unearth the history of the silencing of women. And she is the one who's largely responsible for this concept of the double bind. The double bind occurs when, in this case, women find it impossible to simultaneously satisfy two sets of gendered expectations. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But another thing that Jamieson does in her book is, as I said, to unearth the history of silencing women. She helps us see that going way far back in not just American history, but the history of Western civilization, there's been a deep concern about the troubling implications, the troubling notion of women speaking in public, let alone grasping at power, let alone claiming a mantle of leadership, but simply speaking. Now, I don't know how many of you might recognize this cartoon rendering on the slide. Anybody know what that might be a picture of? You do? Very good. You want to tell us what it's, do you remember what it's called? Well, yes, it is, but this is a very, thank you, Salem witch trials. Associated with that yes, this is a very specific device and ritual that was used, that Jamieson writes about in her book, as a way of keeping troublesome women silent. So it was often used against women who were accused of witchcraft, but not exclusively in that context. This is called the ducking stool. And the idea was that you would drop the woman tied to the stool into the water, and similar to other rituals that you've heard of, if she drowned, that must have meant that she was innocent. It was a way of silencing women, teaching them that their role was not to speak out. And so women who were considered quarrelsome, women who were considered shrill, women who were considered overbearing to husbands and other men in their lives could be subjected to this ritual. Jamieson uses this as a way of, again, showing us this long history, but also I want to point out one thing that's so powerful about her book. I would not do it justice if I didn't mention this. Jamieson's argument is that these double binds have long held women back, but at the same time, women have continually found ways through, around, under, over the double binds that they've been presented with. And so she uses this history to say, given this history, women have accomplished a remarkable amount and continue to find ways to move forward. Another touchstone scholar for our book was Barbara Welter's work on the cult of true womanhood. And you may or may not be familiar with this work, but her argument was that particularly in 18th and 19th century America, a cult, as she put it, grew up around the notion of appropriate womanhood, appropriate femininity. And some of you are probably familiar with public sphere versus private sphere, for example. Welter's argument is similar, that a certain notion of femininity and womanhood took root in this time, which we have not completely rid ourselves of. The notion that true women are, of course, pure, and are also silent in public and respectful and deferential to the males around them, that is their appropriate place. So these twin ideas deeply rooted in our culture are part of what any female candidate faces when she seeks the presidency. And the reason for that, of course, is that the US presidency is probably the most macho job on the planet. To control the most powerful military, not only in the world now, but probably in the history of the world, to be the representative of the world's oldest democracy on the international stage. This is a very masculinized job, and in case you don't recognize the two pictures that I've referenced here, these are just two thought experiments for you. You probably, many of you of a certain age, recognize the top image of Michael Dukakis during the 1988 campaign, whose campaign decided it would be a great idea to create a photo op that would bolster his national security bona fides by putting him atop a tank with a helmet and letting him drive it around for the reporters to take pictures of. As you might recall or imagine, there was quite a bit of blowback and unintended consequences from this particular photo op. What Melody and I found really striking as we went back and looked at these examples was that Dukakis and his campaign felt a need to do this at all. In essence, to say not just that his national security bona fides were adequate, but that his masculinity was adequate to the job. Contrast that with the bottom image, George W. Bush, and probably many of you remember the context of this particular picture. This is the same day as the infamous Mission Accomplished speech given aboard a battleship off the coast of California. Earlier in the day, of course, Bush's team had him jetted in, dressed in a flight suit as a jet pilot himself, and swaggering down the deck of the battleship with the military guys here, as you see. And you probably can't quite make it out in the picture, but with the tight-fitting crotch straps as well, a kind of flagrant display of masculinity in the presidency. So this is the stage that women candidates enter. And I have to credit, again, my co-author Melody for coining a phrase that we use in the book, which is to say, we tend to treat gender as though it's absent from the presidential stage until a woman walks on. But actually, gender is very active on the presidential stage. It's been gendered in a particular masculine direction. So to speak a little bit more about the double binds and then to move on to our second set of factors, the double binds that Jameson highlights in her book, we think are still quite relevant. And of course, these are concepts now that have become pretty widely recognized, pretty widely used, even by some campaigns themselves. The first is pretty well known, the idea of femininity versus competence. Again, the idea of the double bind is that it's very difficult to simultaneously satisfy both sets of demands. Any woman who seeks the presidency is going to have to show that she's tough enough, man enough, if you will, for the job. But the trick for women is to do that while not seeming inappropriately unfeminine. So how can you be both tough and competent on the one hand, but still womanly, recognizably feminine, if you will, and to do those things both at once can be quite challenging. We liken it to having to walk a very fine tightrope, a very fine balance beam between these competing considerations. Another gendered double bind that Kathleen Hall Jameson points out is what she calls equality versus difference, and it's one that we saw very much at work in 2008. That is that women can stake their claim to power on the basis of equality, which is very much what Hillary Clinton did in 2008, which is to say, I am equal to the men on the stage. I have all the equal competencies and experiences and expertise that they have. Don't pay attention to my gender. Gender doesn't matter. On the other hand, you could stake a claim based in difference. You could say, my feminine experiences, my experiences as a woman give me a certain set of qualifications that, yes, are different and also qualify me for this job, which is not a claim so much that Hillary Clinton, I think, made in 2008, but that is still a choice, a strategic choice that female candidates face. So we've talked now a little bit about gender norms to set the stage. The second set of factors that, of course, I'm quite interested in are the media routines for covering presidential and electoral politics. There's a very large literature in this area, and interestingly, it was not until I began writing this book that I realized that so much of the political communication scholarship didn't talk very much about women. In part, maybe because we just haven't had very many women candidates, particularly at the presidential level, but also because it seemed, again, to be kind of absent from the stage until a woman walked on. Now, there is a nice, smaller literature that I will talk about in just a second. But one thing that we were keen to do in this book is, again, to point out that it's not just gender that's at work. If a woman candidate faces challenges reaching her political goals, it's not just because of gender, sexism, gender bias that she might have trouble. Something all candidates, male or female, must navigate is the way that the media cover them. Now, there used to be the old saying that the path to the White House runs through the newsroom. That may be a little less true today with the struggling and fragmentation of mainstream media, the rise of social media, something I'd like to talk about more in a few minutes. But it is still true that, as best as we can tell anyway, any presidential hopeful has to build a media strategy, has to build a positive relationship with reporters, and has to try to win favorable news coverage. And they can find that very hard to do because of the three patterns that I've listed briefly for you here. First of all, what we know, campaigns get covered largely in terms of the game frame, as scholars often call it, or the horse race, as you probably heard the phrase. That is, reporters pay the most attention to who's winning, who's losing, what tactics and strategies are they using to get ahead, why, tactically speaking, are they falling behind. So far less coverage in every presidential election going back for decades since we've had the tools to do this analysis. Every presidential election has been marked by this kind of coverage. It's mostly about who's winning and who's losing, the up and the down, the horse race of it, rather than the things you might think the media would be spending most of their time on, like policy positions, like credentials and expertise, like the life history and character and competencies of the candidates. Those things get very much a second place. This is tough for candidates. And it's tough for candidates in ways that you might not expect. It's obvious that if you're falling behind in a presidential race, that might mean that you're going to get more coverage that's going to look negative. Because if it's game framed and it's about the horse race and you can't show momentum, quote unquote, then it's hard to gain traction. It's hard to get a good story out of that. But it's also hard, paradoxically, for the frontrunners. This is something that the scholar Thomas Patterson pointed out in his research, 2 decades ago now, going back and being able to show that for decades, the front runner is the one who gets the most negative coverage. Almost like a kind of an automatic pushback from the media, who may feel as though it's their responsibility to scrutinize that candidate more closely. I'll never forget, in 2008, CNN's Gloria Borger was on a panel with some other political reporters and pundits, and someone said, well, why wouldn't Clinton want to seem like she was the front runner in the lead? And Borger bursting out laughing and saying, because it's the kiss of death. Reporters know this. The general public may not usually know this. So one of the challenges candidates have to navigate is that media routine of the game frame and the horse race. A second that they have to manage will be intuitively familiar to you, and that is the idea of master narratives. That reporters tend to settle on a storyline about particular candidate characters pretty early in the race. And once that notion sets in, it's very hard for the campaign to shake that framing. And so you may think back to that election between, say, George W. Bush and Al Gore. What was the rap on Al Gore? He was boring. He was full of himself. He claimed to invent the internet, right? Very hard for him then to shake that framing. What was the rap on George W. Bush? He was dim. He wasn't smart enough to hold the presidential stage, even though he turned out to be quite politically savvy in many ways. So it can be very challenging for campaigns to kind of shake off that framing that sets in early on. And finally, there's a focus on what we call defining moments. Most campaigns have them. Some moment that takes on a life of its own, that becomes larger than life in the story of the campaign, that seems to reveal something about the candidate. And so you can think back, for example, to the 2004 campaign during the Democratic nomination race when Howard Dean was squaring off against John Kerry. And we all probably remember what happened to Howard Dean after Iowa when he went to that campaign event, and what did he do? He screamed. And that one scream, lifted a bit out of context, helped the media to decide that he was not ready for the presidential stage. And reporters have talked rather openly about this. We saw that moment, and we realized he didn't really know how to handle himself on a stage where the whole world was watching. So that one moment came to take on a much greater significance in the story of the Dean campaign overall, and indeed, some would argue, helped to end his candidacy. So these three challenges I would offer are not particularly gendered in and of themselves. These are challenges every presidential candidate has to navigate. But there are challenges that are specific perhaps for women. Now here, the literature, the scholarly literature, doesn't give us a lot of guidance because, again, we haven't had that many female presidential candidates. So most of the literature that's looked at how women candidates are covered in the United States has had to look at Senate races, House races, gubernatorial races, and a little bit of study in offices lower than that. So a huge open question remains, what do we know about how female presidential candidates are covered? And we still don't have that many because now we have the same one in 2016 as we did in 2008. So what we did in the book was to look at what that literature had predicted based on those other offices and figure out how well it applied to Hillary Clinton's bid in 2008. The literature predicted that, first of all, women tend to get less coverage than men candidates, that there tends to be more of an emphasis on their physical appearance, their manner of dress, their tone of voice, their family history, their children, their husbands, etc., although that already had begun to fade by the time we were writing in 2008. That women candidates might be more often called by their first name than men would be, and that there tends to be a narrative of first. There's a very fine book by Erica Falk that looks at the history of women contending for the presidency and the way that they have been covered in the news, and one of the patterns she finds going way back is the idea that every time a woman ran for president, it was as if it was the first time. So they have tended to get covered in terms of their novelty, their difference, and that then raises questions sometimes about their viability politically, whether they can really win the race. So what did we find in 2008, bringing these things together? In terms of gender double binds, obviously, we concluded that those mattered, that those shaped Hillary Clinton's strategizing, and indeed shaped, we think, some of the reasons why she struggled in 2008. And one thing we talk about at some length in that book is the way that Hillary Clinton chose to walk that tightrope. She tended to emphasize very much her experience, her credentials, and she didn't really bring gender into the picture very much in 2008, except in specific moments and specific settings. But it wasn't a consistent theme throughout her campaign. In fact, you may remember her concession speech in June of 2008, which really had the most explicit talk that we had seen throughout the campaign about the challenges that women face. This was the famous cracks in the glass ceiling speech, right? That kind of language wasn't really present very much during the campaign, and at the time in 2008, we speculated a little bit, how would it have mattered if she would have talked a little bit more about gender, if she would have talked a little bit more about what it is to be a woman on the presidential stage, if she would have staked a claim based a little bit more in difference and maybe a little bit less in equality. So we'll talk about that more in just a minute. In terms of media routines, obviously those mattered a great deal, and we analyzed those at some length in the book. We did find, however, I'll go ahead and shift this slide for you so you can see, we did find that one of the key predictions of the literature turned out not to be true in Hillary Clinton's case. In 2008, she got throughout much of the campaign more than or at least equal coverage to her main opponent, Barack Obama. And as you may be able to see in this slide, it's only fairly late in the 2008 campaign season when it becomes clear that mathematically speaking, she cannot win the nomination. She cannot win enough delegates. It's really only at that point that Barack Obama breaks ahead in terms of news coverage. But as you can see, for many months during that campaign, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were neck and neck in terms of the raw amount of coverage that they were getting in mainstream media, which is what we were analyzing here. Evening broadcast news, leading newspapers, et cetera. Interestingly, as you can see, it was actually John McCain who struggled to get an equal amount of coverage. But given the closeness of the race in 2008 and the unprecedented nature of it, that you had an African-American man and a white woman battling it out for the nomination, created quite a bit of news interest. So that was not her challenge. Her challenge wasn't in terms of quantity of coverage, it was in terms of the quality of the coverage. So we analyzed this in the book as well, and I've included just a few anecdotes here. Anecdotes can always be misleading, of course, but these are kind of illustrative of the more subtle and sometimes unsubtle ways that gender was introduced into the discussion. And of course, you may recall that there were a fair number of Hillary Clinton supporters and feminists of all stripes who were very angry by the end of the 2008 campaign because they felt like the media had been very gendered, even very sexist in its treatment of her. One thing we try to make clear in the book is that the out-and-out sexist stuff didn't, by and large, happen in the mainstream press. That was happening, by and large, on cable news. And as a matter of fact, it was largely happening on MSNBC, interestingly, where you had some of the most egregious examples, including a few that I have on the slide for you here. So the long and the short of it is that the media mattered. We don't think that gendered double binds and gendered norms sunk her campaign. We don't think that the media single-handedly sunk her campaign. We think it was a combination of those things. And again, that third important set of factors, the candidate and her context. So I'll just quickly highlight a few elements of the context here, and then we can get to talking a little bit more about Hillary Clinton then and now. In terms of the campaign context, of course, every US presidential election, in a sense, is utterly different than any one that's come before it. There's lots of ways in which they're the same, but there's always significant differences in terms of the array of candidates who are competing, the particular profiles and strategies that they bring to the election. And there's also the fact of the different teams that they assemble around them and how expertly those teams strategize. One thing that the Clinton camp did not do well in 2008 was manage the electoral calendar. So you may or may not recall that the Clinton team was so confident of its own superiority and likelihood of winning that they didn't strategize very effectively beyond Super Tuesday. So they expected to kind of sweep the primaries on Super Tuesday. They didn't have much of a strategy or much of a campaign bank account to last them beyond that and to really take them into that hard-fought battle. So that's just one small example of the ways in which the context of the particular candidate really matter for understanding the outcomes of elections. Now there's also this second contextual factor, this little factor of Barack Obama. One of the most talented orators and politicians of our time, a man with an incredibly compelling life story and an incredibly compelling candidate for many reasons for many voters. This was not just any opponent that Hillary Clinton faced in 2008. We can talk about that more during the Q&A, and I'm sure whole books could be written about that. But let me just zoom ahead and point out that Hillary Rodham Clinton herself is, of course, unlike any other candidate because she has had a very long history in the public eye, going back to before her days in the White House as First Lady, but especially many of the patterns that I think we're still seeing played out today were really set and crystallized during her time as First Lady in the 1990s. It was fun to go back and look for visual images from that time period. I don't know if you can tell from this slide, but this is a protest that happened during the time that Hillary Clinton was trying to lead the charge for healthcare reform. This is so evocative in so many ways because, first of all, it reminds us that Hillary Clinton was a very unconventional first lady. So not only do we have the historical anomaly of a woman who has been first lady trying to become president, but she was also very unlike any other first lady that we had seen, and I would argue that even we've seen since. And she, of course, had become polarizing in the public eye, going way back to the 1990s, and had got off to the wrong foot with the National Press Corps going back to the 1990s, and all of those patterns were very much evident in 2008. So let me just exemplify one of these defining moments from 2008 very quickly. Some of you will remember the so-called teary-eyed moment, which happened in a diner in New Hampshire just 1 or 2 days before the New Hampshire primary. And this was a breakfast event at a diner, and somebody who was at the event, a woman, commented something to Hillary Clinton about, gosh, it seems like you're trying to do a lot, it must be really hard. And there was this moment, a fleeting moment, really, if you counted it, you could count the seconds on your hand, but a fleeting moment where her eyes appeared to well up with tears, and she kind of sunk her head onto her chin, and she said, well, it's not easy. I'll tell you, it's not easy. And then Hillary, being Hillary, pivoted onto her predetermined talking points, if you will, got herself back on track, and went on to make a case for her candidacy based on experience and credentials and policy positions. But those fleeting moments of the apparently tear-filled eyes took on a larger-than-life significance in the news. So it reminds us, first of all, about the importance of these gender norms because, as her opponent at the time, John Edwards, quipped, so is this the way she's going to deal with Kim Jong-il, the leader at the time of North Korea? At the same time, it reminds us of the importance of the particular candidate and her particular profile. Because for Hillary Clinton, this moment was not unalloyed bad news. So it didn't play well with some audiences, but it played very well with others. And in fact, the media reporting was all over the map after this moment, because some reporters felt as though, wow, aha, she's finally shown some human vulnerability. Paul Begala used to quip during the 2008 campaign that when Hillary gets up to speak to an audience, there's about 2 feet of bulletproof glass between her heart and that audience. Well, here was a moment where that seemed to dissolve. And so in some interesting ways, because it was Hillary Clinton, a moment of crying was not entirely a bad thing for her. And in fact, I don't think this necessarily holds water, but you may recall that some people attributed her win in New Hampshire to this moment. Could be true. I'm skeptical, but it could be true. But it is a great reminder of those 3 interlocking factors. So before we move on from 2008, I just have to mention one other thing. There was another gender dynamic going on during 2008. It played out just a little bit later, of course, because Clinton concedes in June, and sometime in August, we were introduced to John McCain's running mate, and then the rest is history. And thank you very much, Paul, for making sure that Sarah was here with us this evening. There's nothing like having her look at me with that grin the whole time that I'm talking. I just wanted to point this out, and this is something that Melody and I have gone on to write about in another piece. There were, in essence, 2 ways of doing gender that got demonstrated, that got performed for us during that election. There was Hillary Clinton with her pantsuits, her second-wave feminism, her tough skin from many years of fighting battles, and her emphasis on equality and competence and qualifications. And then there's Sarah Palin. And I don't know about you, but I've asked a lot of people, do you remember when you first saw Sarah Palin? And many people have a vivid memory. I know for Melody and I it was vivid. We were at the American Political Science Association meeting, actually. We were in our hotel room working on this book when we watched the event where McCain introduced her, and we both said, what? Because she was doing the things that political consultants had been counseling female candidates not to do for decades, right? the super high heels, the pearls, the beehive, the high-pitched voice, all of those things. Women have been trained to try not to do those things. And she was out there with her, how many kids does she have? Five children. She was out there with all her children, right? These were all the things women were told not to do. She was drawing attention to her difference. She was drawing attention to her femininity, if you will. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. It was another factor for another book, not something we wrote about in that one. So now, fast forward, 2016. Let's think about what's the same and what's different this time around, and I really am eager to hear some of your ideas. I'll begin by just reviewing a few things that seem to me like they are more or less the same this time around. First and foremost, Hillary Clinton again enters the race as the presumed frontrunner, and once again I would contend that is a problem as much as it is a benefit. It's a huge benefit in terms of resources, name recognition, early strong ground game, all of those kinds of things, and at the same time, in terms of media coverage, the pattern is tried and true. If you're the frontrunner, the coverage is probably going to be largely negative, or at least skewed more negative. She still, of course, has a rather rocky relationship with the press, as you might have noticed. She is still more PC than Mac. You may remember this meme from 2008, where Barack Obama was, the shiny new Mac, if you will. He was the high-tech, the savvy, the cool kid, right? Whereas Hillary Clinton in her pantsuits was kind of the dowdy PC, kind of your grandmother and grandfather's computer, if you will. So I think that image, that persona, that set of baggage has continued to follow her into 2016. And we also see in 2016, maybe even more vividly in 2008, that younger voters in particular don't necessarily embrace the style of feminism that she enacts on the stage. That, if you will, older style of feminism, about equality, not difference, about pantsuits, not high-cut skirts. This is a brand of feminism that I know to my 16-year-old daughter is kind of foreign and not very appealing. And certainly for a lot of young voters, we have some survey evidence to suggest, at least, that this idea that one should show some solidarity with a female candidate just isn't that appealing to a lot of younger voters, male and female. So that's been a hindrance for her, for sure. And oh yeah, gender double binds still do exist in 2016. I love this headline from The Onion from a few months ago. Female candidate who was United States Senator, Secretary of State, told to be more inspiring. So there's still a sense in which women, what's the old Ginger Rogers phrase? You have to, dance all the same moves, right? But you have to do it in high heels and backwards. There's still the sense that perhaps it's just tougher for women to get acknowledged for their experience, their competence, etc. Okay, so let's just say that's all more or less the same. You may disagree, and I look forward to hearing about that. But let's talk about what's different. 2016, how fascinating. What an array of candidates we have seen. We have seen, as Paul pointed out in his opening remarks, we've seen, for example, somebody try to claim the nomination of a party to which he doesn't belong, and another guy try to claim the nomination for a party that he didn't used to belong to, and doesn't seem to share very much in common with its elite, anyway. So you've got a lot of interesting things going on in 2016. But I think one of the most interesting, we've talked about this tightrope, this balance beam that women candidates, especially if they want the presidency, that they're going to have to walk. How can you be tough enough and still be woman enough? And I think Hillary Clinton has got two storylines now that she didn't have in 2008. She has two aspects to her character that she couldn't talk about in 2008. She has, on the one hand, pardon me, but badass Secretary of State, and that meme has become so popular, she's got these foreign policy, national security credentials. Agree with her on the issues or not, she's got the experience now that she can credibly say, I'm prepared to lead in this realm in a way that she didn't have in 2008. As a matter of fact, it's really interesting to me. I haven't seen survey data on this myself, but I think that a lot of voters, when they think now of Hillary Clinton, they don't think former First Lady. They don't even think necessarily former senator from New York. They think Madam Secretary. That's pretty interesting. And then secondly, oh yeah, she's a grandma. So if you go to some of her social media feeds, for example, she leads with her womanly identity. She leads with herself as a mother and a grandmother in a way that she did not really do to the same degree in 2008. So I think, in a sense, this is what I mean when I say I think we have a somewhat different candidate this time around, even though she's nominally the same person and certainly still has some of the same baggage. Her gender strategy, I think, has been markedly different this time around. The gentleman crossed out in this picture you may or may not recognize as Mark Penn, who ran her campaign in 2008 and who I think is partly credited with a very confusing gender strategy in 2008, where you would mostly see Hillary being run as kind of the toughest guy in the room, and then every once in a while, oh yeah, but I'm also a woman, come on ladies, you should vote for me. I think there's been a more, like it or not, there's been a more gendered tone to the campaign and to the appeals this time around. I don't know if any of you have your woman card, but the Hillary Clinton campaign actually issued real women cards. That is something that in 2008 was almost unthinkable because the woman card, the gender card, was to be avoided. And this time they have claimed it, as you can see in the quote that I have here. Again, I don't know if that wins you an election or not, but it's certainly different and it's certainly noteworthy. I think there's another thing that's changed. I don't really know how to analyze this very rigorously, but pop culture has changed. In just 8 years, I think we have kind of the advent of a different kind of feminine hero, if you will. And I think that that's indicative of a larger set of changes. So if we think back to our 3 contextual factors that I talked about through the early part of this talk, if we think back to gendered norms, if we think to media routines, and we think the candidate in her context, the immediate context can shift a lot, election to election. Media routines have been pretty stable for several decades. Gender norm stuff go way, way back, so I'm not trying to suggest that everything is radically different today, but I do think that there's been movement, there's been changes, not just in pop culture, but in our laws, for example. We now have Supreme Court validation of same-sex marriage, something that was unthinkable probably a decade ago. So I think there are changes afoot in our culture that we've only begun to sort of get a handle on and think about how they will matter for a female candidacy. Finally, I would point out one thing that's really different this time around is the ability and the ubiquity of social media. It's not that there was no social media in 2008, but it has taken on a much more central role today. And I think Hillary Clinton has been particularly skilled at using her social media platforms. Now, if you hear about social media in this campaign, you're likely hearing a lot about Donald Trump on Twitter, because the evidence is pretty clear that he's actually used Twitter very masterfully to drive the news narrative, to bring attention continually to himself and his controversial statements. But I think if you spend a little time on the different social media platforms, you'll see that it's actually, interestingly, Hillary Clinton's team that's doing a very lovely job with what some social media platforms are really designed for, which is creating a kind of parasocial relationship with the other person, creating a sense of intimacy with somebody that you don't actually personally know. And I would say her campaign is actually doing that pretty effectively. At the same time, path to the White House still runs through the newsroom, and many of Hillary Clinton's challenges today, I think, can be in part attributed to her poor relations with the press. This is not to say that she is not her own worst enemy. I think that her tendency, this is me speaking my opinion, I think her tendency to circle the wagons, to close down on information rather than to reveal it, to not get out in front of stories and instead let them happen to her, I think that that is a very problematic tendency. And at this point, it seems to be pretty hardwired for her. But at the same time, some blame has to be given to the press, who I think have not tried to cover her with a fresh lens, but instead have brought a lot of their old animosities, their old frameworks, their old storylines to this campaign, and she has all too willingly played along with that. So I think that many of her challenges around likability, so to speak, around character, around ethics, really do have something to do with this bad relationship with the media. Speaking of the media, I just want to say 2 other relatively quick things and then get to some Q&A with you. I want to point out a couple of paradoxes. There's way too much going on this slide. Sorry, I meant to clean it up this morning, didn't have a chance to do that. But you've got what for me is a fascinating paradox, because I've been studying political communication for some time now, and the assumption has usually been that you need to get a lot of news coverage in order to win the White House. And of course, you'd rather have that be favorable news coverage. And as a matter of fact, Hillary Clinton, on almost every measure, is getting less coverage, certainly, than Donald Trump. She's getting more than her share, if you will, of negative coverage. And yet, according to at least some measures, she seems to have a pretty solid lead. This particular screen grab is from a few days ago when the upshot put her at 83% chance of winning. I think as of today, it's been revised to 80% chance of winning. Those are still pretty good odds. So it's interesting, you have this one dynamic going on in the media, which is pretty negative, pretty focused on, emails. Have we heard a lot about emails? And about her character and her likability and her trustworthiness. And yet she's got this very commanding lead that may have something to do with her opponent. The second paradox that I find really interesting is this. I'll let you study this if you can see it and decide for yourself which of these scorecards from the fact-checking organization PolitiFact belongs to Hillary Clinton and which one of these belongs to Donald Trump, her opponent. And yet, even though their scores are very different, it is Hillary Clinton who's struggling with the trustworthiness question. It is she, not Donald Trump, who's falling behind in the public's eyes in terms of trustworthiness. And I just think that's very fascinating. Trustworthiness doesn't necessarily rest in things like fact-checking, right? It doesn't rest necessarily on the factuality of your claims, but rather something else, that ineffable other quality that she has always struggled to attain. Again, the candidate and her context. So, how does Donald Trump matter in all of this? I think that will be a lively point for us to talk about if you wish, but I would just quickly point out one interesting thing, and that is that talk about gender on the presidential stage, this may be the most gendered election that we've seen in a long time, because we see a major candidate who is performing his gender, performing his masculinity in a fairly colorful way, shall we say. And it has a history of problematic comments and behavior toward women. So Hillary Clinton is running on a very gendered stage, like times 10 this time around. And I think it's fascinating. Who would have expected that? I don't think she expected that, and indeed she didn't really encounter that in the same way in 2008. So I'll just finish by saying we have many weeks to go until the campaign. There's a lot that could still unfold. In fact, interesting things unfolding since yesterday, as you know, and I think we probably have a lot to talk about. So I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. Thank you.